Welcome back, brothers, to Warhammer. Tonight we're diving the madness that lurks in the Ghoul stars. Before we get into the video, be sure to like, comment any videos, topics, ideas you want to see in the future. Be sure to subscribe for the Emperor. Now I want to thank you guys for the support. Got to kill it like usual. Be sure to check out the merch in the description below. Now, let's get to the video.
There are swathes of the galaxy, the Imperium trumpets in its catechisms, regions where the banners of the Adeptus Terra have been hammered into compliant worlds and the light of the Emperor is said to shine unchallenged. And then there are places that the Imperium pretends not to see. The Ghoul stars are one of those places, a rot black wound gnawing into the halo of the eastern fringe, spoken of in low tones by those few who know the name at all, and studiously ignored by those who are supposed to. On the grand illuminated star charts that hang in the Strategium vaults of Battlefleet Ultima, the Ghoul stars are not a proud proclamation of dominion. They are a shadow. Follow the crowded trunk routes and sanctioned warp corridors outward from the Segmentum's heart, past the last mustering yards and neglected colony clusters, and the lines thin, break, and then cease. Beyond the eastern fringe, north and somewhat sunward, where the halo stars mark the farthest reaches of the galactic disk, there lies a tract of wilderness given only the vaguest designations. Its stellar catalogues are incomplete by design. Its systems are recorded as unproductive, unsurveyed, of no great import. The parchment around those notations is always slightly thicker, as if it has been scraped clean and rewritten too many times. In the official lexicon of the Administratum, the Ghoul stars are wilderness space, a marginal halo region whose resource exploitation has been judged inefficient. The clerks of the Departamento Cartographicae learn the words early, inscribing them in cramped script beneath faded constellations. Uncharted, unproductive, anomalous. They write them so often that they become rote prayers, a way to avoid putting the truth into ink. Even here, even in the latter half of the 41st millennium, when mankind claims that its domain spans from galactic rim to galactic core, there is a region that makes the Adeptus Terra lower its gaze. The position of the Ghoul stars is treacherous in ways that go beyond simple distance. They lie out past those frontier sectors that the Imperium half-heartedly garrisons, beyond the last way stations where an Imperial frigate may find repair and resupply before tackling the trackless void. The Ghoul stars are anchored in a band of space where the great beacon of the Astronomicon is not a steady sun-like presence, but a faltering echo, scattered and diminished by unknown currents. Their stars are not the hot, generous fires that burn over coreward planets. They are thin, failing lights, guttering over graveyard worlds. Those systems that have been reached and imperfectly recorded tell a consistent story. The suns burn with a tired, reddish pallor, swollen to the edge of collapse or shrunk to pallid embers. Their planets are cold, their atmospheres thin or gone entirely. Many are bare stone, scored with the scars of ancient bombardment. Others retain the shells of cities and megastructures, latticework hives and orbital rings left to rust and freeze. Under those dim stars stand skeletal megalopolises, towers of darkened hab blocks and severed transit spines. Docking spurs jut out into vacuum, their umbilicals torn or dangling, waiting eternally for ships that will never return. On still other worlds, the remains a stranger. There are planets whose surfaces are a chaotic tangle of incomplete architectures, half-excavated pits, and the stumps of machines whose purpose no adept of Mars has ever been able to interpret. The structures repeat in fractal arrangements, spiraling across continents in patterns that do not conform to any known human or Xenos logic. Here and there, these relics are fused, melted, as if struck not by conventional orbital fire, but by some force that briefly liquefied stone and metal together. No bodies are found in such places, no bones, only the memory of industry and the silence of abandonment. To reach these stars at all is a blasphemy of navigation. The void between the eastern fringe and the Ghoul stars is not empty, but what fills it is inimical to sane passage. The Emperor's great psychic beacon, so blinding across the heart of the Imperium that it burns eternal in the minds of navigators, is here a thin, stuttering thread. It is swallowed, occluded, or refracted by tides that do not appear on any standard warp chart. Even the most ancient Navis Nobilitae dynasties speak of the Ghoul stars with reluctance. To steer a vessel beyond the last dependable waypoints is to step outside the known lattice of warp routes and into a place where the sea itself seems to move the coasts. There are logs, smuggled out of inquisitorial vaults or copied from seized navigator journals, that speak of those voyages. They describe constellations that rearrange themselves between one translation and the next, of lightless gulfs that the third eye cannot perceive at all, only an absence where the warp falls mute. They speak of currents that tug a vessel sideways in time as well as distance, of routes that deposit a fleet into a sky whose star patterns belong to another epoch. Some navigators describe the sensation of being watched, not by demons or the familiar predatory minds of the Imperium, but by something patient and distant, like a vast intellect half glimpsed behind a veil. Many refuse such assignments outright. Among the Voidborn, reputation carries its own currency, and there are house names that will not risk their bloodlines on Ghoul Stars charters, no matter the promises of reward. The vessels that do go do not always come back. Those that return often do so altered. Sometimes they emerge in wholly unintended sectors, their hulls scarred, their astropaths dead or raving, their navigators blind or catatonic, their chrono readings impossible. Sometimes they appear apparently unmarked, yet their crews are not the same men who set out. They speak in whispers, flinch at shadows, and stare up at the night sky as if expecting familiar patterns to betray them. The Administratum is not blind to such losses, but it is adept at transforming catastrophe into paperwork. On the most expansive stellar charts, the deeper Ghoul stars are underlined with oblique annotations. Mechanicus survey stamps are overwritten with austere Gothic script. Quarantined, unsurveyed, anomalous warp phenomena. These terms recur with suspicious frequency, often in conjunction with the same worlds. Attached expeditionary logs are truncated mid-transmission, marked as corrupted or simply absent. The record trail ends in rubber-stamped notices of censure and the reassignment of responsible officials to penal tithing audits in distant sectors. There are marginalia in the archives of the Ordo Xenos and the Ordo Hereticus that hint at a more truthful narrative. Behind heavy purity seals and privacy sigils, one finds references to repeated attempts at establishing footholds in the Ghoul stars, to colonization efforts and reclamation projects dating back to the dark age of technology and the Emperor's own Great Crusade. There were once, by all accounts, multiple human-inhabited worlds in that region, settled by ambitious fleets bearing pre-imperial technology, and later retaken under the Aquila's shadow. For a time, those worlds thrived, their data added to the sum of imperial knowledge. Then their names fall away. In the span of a few centuries, sometimes less, the lines thick with traffic and supply entries thin and vanish. Those worlds are struck from living registers and consigned to categories used for plagues, demon infestations, or catastrophic Xenos overruns. Yet in most such cases, the enemy is named in full. Orcs leave a spore of distinctive aggression across the ledger. The Great Devourer is catalogued with obsessive care. Here, in these Ghoul Stars entries, the enemy is instead recorded with curiously non-committal phrases. Unknown hostile agency, ancient threat, unclassified extermination event. The ink around those words is always a little darker. The relics of those dead human empires endure on certain worlds, where ships have been able to approach closely enough to scan. vast transit webs without passengers, manufactoria without workers, fortress cities with their walls unbreached and their gun emplacements unsilenced by bombardment. The signs of sudden annihilation are subtle. No titanic craters testify to orbital fire. No colossal breaches mark where Xenos engines ground through ferrocrete and steel. Rather, there is a pervasive emptiness, as if some force more discriminating than brute war selected what it wanted and took only that. Structures remain, soil remains, atmosphere in many cases remains. Life does not. It is not an accident that Nostromo, the night-shrouded world that birthed the 8th Legion, hung on the border of this region. The planet's star was a dim, sullen thing, its light unable to pierce the heavy industrial cloud canopy that wrapped the world in permanent twilight. The men who grew in its choking hive stacks were raised on fear, predation, and despair. Their entire culture was shaped by the certainty that the sky above them concealed only cold indifference and the promise of worse things still. When that world finally tore itself apart under the accumulated weight of its sins and the deliberate vengeance of its most infamous son, its shards tumbled into a void already haunted by older ruins and darker legends. Nostromo was not formally counted within the Ghoul stars, but it was a neighbor, close enough that its citizens could look up on the rare clear nights and see unfamiliar constellations glimmering where Imperial charts grew sparse. It is tempting, for certain savants, to draw a symbolism from this proximity. On one side of that border, a world that cultured murderers until an entire legion of them strode the stars, clad in midnight ceramite. On the other side, entire civilizations erased so thoroughly that their names survive, only as codification numbers on redacted lists. The frontier between such spaces does not encourage optimism. The adepts of the Departamento Cartographicae, those monastic scribes who dedicate their lives to the precise mapping of the Emperor's claimed domain, are not prone to superstition. They are trained to see the galaxy in terms of mass, vector, resource, and tithe. For them, a star is a node in a web of obligation and productivity, a point whose significance lies in how many regiments can be raised, how much ore extracted, how much grain rendered. Yet even their most exhaustive charts show the Ghoul stars as a near blank smear, a zone of under-detailed systems scrawled over with cautious notation. The eye is drawn to its edges and then skitters away, as if the concentrated absence is an affront to the tidy minds of terror. In a galaxy that the Imperium insists belongs to mankind by divine right, this is a quiet heresy. The catechisms of the ecclesiarchy speak of an unbroken tide of human conquest sweeping from core to rim. The Imperial Tactica. Imperialis extols the endless crusades that bring light to the darkest corners of space. Propaganda pict feeds show stylized maps where the Aquala's wings stretch from one side of the galaxy to the other, smothering all beneath. Nowhere in those rousing declarations is there room for a region where the Imperium has looked upon what waits in the dark and chosen not to advance. Yet the Ghoul stars exist, and the very way they are treated betrays the limits of that arrogance. Instead of crusade paths, there are warning sigils. Instead of triumphant battle honors, there are sealed records. Instead of victory parades, there are quiet reassignments and unexplained losses. The Imperium does not loudly declare its fear. It encodes it in euphemism, in cartographic omissions, in the careful underfunding of expeditions that might raise more questions than answers. But the fear is there. This is the first truth of the Ghoul stars. They are not merely a dangerous borderland or another theater of ceaseless war. They are a wound gnawed deep into the edge of the known, a place where even the Imperium's usual responses of overwhelming brutality and fanatic faith have proved insufficient or inappropriate. What waits there is not simply another enemy to name and hate. The hints that bleed through censored logs and corrupted data slates speak of phenomena that do not sit comfortably within existing categories. Plagues that behave like thinking entities, learning as they spread. Machines whose operations span sectors, treating civilizations as moving parts within some inhuman mechanism. Empires that do not fall to invasion, but simply vanish from every record at once, leaving only erasures and the faintest ghost impressions in the warp. Later chronicles will speak in guarded terms of star-spawned contagions and nightmare engines, of Necron realms gone rabid with hunger and Xenos breeds whose biology seems to mock natural law. They will record crusades that vanish into that gloom and watch stations tasked with staring into it forever in case something stirs. But at the beginning, there is simply this: an expanse of dim suns and dead worlds beyond the reach of the Emperor's light, so hostile and so unknown that the most ruthless regime in the galaxy has chosen to avert its gaze and pretend that the wound will not fester further if ignored. In the distant age when mankind first clawed its way to the stars, before the Imperium, before the Emperor strode from Terra to bind humanity in chains of faith and iron, the Ghoul stars were not yet a byword for dread. To the techno-barbarian lords and visionary archmagos of the dark age of technology, this region beyond the eastern fringe was not a forbidden graveyard, but an inviting emptiness, a blank canvas upon which to imprint their idea of perfection. The void was rich in raw materials and untouched worlds. The thought that there might be things already there, watching, did not trouble men who believed utterly in their own mastery. Great colony fleets set forth from the heartland of human power, their holds stuffed with the holy constructs that would later be called standard template systems. Each ark was a traveling seed of civilization, bearing databanks that could design anything from hab blocks to hydroponics towers, gene-sealed atmospherics plants, and rad-purging refinery complexes. Alongside these marvels went machine intelligences chained into obedient service, labor engines and overseer cogitators whose minds were cold, swift, and bound in adamantine logic. Men of that era trusted such things as future Imperials would trust prayer. Give them a marginal world, barely more than rock and gas, and the templates would drink the data, shift ancient algorithms, and vomit forth habitable cities. The Ghoul stars lay beyond the eastern marches, a stretch of space that seemed at the time to be merely distant. The colonization fleets sailed into that dark with their holds full of hope and hubris. They bore settlers who had never known want, who viewed hostile atmospheres and harsh gravities as engineering problems to be corrected, not immutable barriers. They founded their first enclaves on worlds whose suns burned cold but steady, whose crusts held metals and volatiles in abundance. Under those dim skies, shining cities rose, their foundations printed by template, their civic routines overseen by calm machine minds. Population registers bloomed. Local data stacks recorded steady increases in output, in life expectancy, in comfort. For a time it worked. In the fragmented records now scattered across 1,000 administratum vaults, one finds fleeting mentions of these colonies. Transit routes list them as refueling stations or minor manufactoria hubs. Merchant ledger fragments note the shipment of refined ores and high-grade isotopes from the Ghoul Stars region back toward more populous sectors. Explorator logs speak, briefly and with professional satisfaction, of successfully activated atmospheric processors and geostabilization grids. The tone is always one of inevitability. Here too, mankind will take root. Here too, the machines will make a home. The modern Imperium knows the Ghoul stars not for those shining beginnings, but for how completely they ended. The way that ending unfolded is recorded only in hints and silences. What little can be recovered shows a pattern that is not as simple as bombardment or conventional war. In the grand indices of the Administratum, many worlds once marked as thriving colonies now bear a different notation. Dead world, former colony. The terse marginalia is a condemnation in itself, but the details beneath are worse. Dates of loss are blurred, overwritten, or missing entirely. In some cases, the entire page has been scraped and written anew, leaving only the faintest scars where a previous narrative once lay. The few survey, reports that survived whatever censure was imposed, tell a fractured story. There are planets where the surface has been vitrified into glass, continents fused into featureless plains by energies beyond even the most excessive of exterminatus protocols. These worlds are dead in the most absolute sense, their atmospheres burned off, their crusts scarred down to the mantle. No ruins stand, no trace of previous habitation endures beyond a spectral radiation signature. Whatever struck them did so with such ferocity that it erased not only life, but history. On other worlds, the opposite is true. There the cities still stand beneath cold suns, their spires intact, their transit webs unbroken. The mag rails gleam faintly under layers of dust. Residential stacks loom over empty plazas. Glow globes hang lifeless in hab corridors, their power sources long drained, but their housings untouched. In such places, there are no great craters, no collapsed walls, no fire-blackened barricades. Neither are there bodies. No skeletons lie sprawled in the streets. No mass graves have been cut into the soil. The Auspex finds trace biological residue in the form of dust, spores, the faint chemical ghost of long-vanished organisms, but nothing that would account for entire planetary populations. It is as if someone walked through those worlds and lifted out the people with a surgeon's care, leaving the structures untouched. Between these extremes lies a spectrum of ruin. Some planets show signs of complex geological upheavals, mountain chains shattered and thrown down, ocean basins drained, islands lifted bodily into the sky and left hanging as floating archipelagos of rock and ice. Others are half consumed, their cities replaced mid-structure by unfamiliar geometries, as though a foreign architecture has begun overwriting the old one, forcing the very matter of the world into new shapes. No single known Xenos or human power exhibits such varied methods of annihilation across multiple systems. The destruction is not uniform, which implies it was not caused by a single catastrophic event, but by a succession of different calamities, or by an intelligence that changed its approach over time. Yet when one reads the Imperial footnotes, the cause is never clearly named. For lesser frontiers, the Imperium is eager to label its foes. It will proudly scrawl orc infestation or tyrannid tendril in thick script across entire sectors. Even the touch of chaos, for all its horror, is at least given a name, a sigil, a category. In the case of the Ghoul stars, the phrasing is consistently evasive. Some ancient threat is believed to have been responsible, say the more candid reports. Elsewhere, the term unknown hostile agency recurs, sometimes annotated with the suggestion that the matter is to be referred to the Ordo Xenos or Ordo Kronos for further classification. The suggestion never seems to have been followed up. That the Imperium, born in fire and confident in its familiarity with every nightmare the galaxy can throw at it, should resist naming what happened there is more telling than any explicit condemnation. Either the investigators genuinely did not understand what they faced, or what they discovered was so potentially destabilizing that the only logical response, by the cruel logic of terror, was to smother it in silence. Complicating any attempt to unravel the fate of those early human polities is the later violence of man against man. During the wars of the heresy and the long scouring that followed, the Nostromo sector and its neighboring regions were subjected to repeated campaigns of punitive devastation. Loyalist fleets, some burning with righteous fury against the 8th Legion's atrocities, others simply following cold directives issued from terror, scoured world after world. cities suspected of harboring traitor sympathizers were leveled from orbit. Industrial hubs were slagged to deny supplies to renegade elements. Entire populations were subjected to exemplary cullings. The records of those actions are often more complete than the earlier colonial logs, because the victors wished to remember their own savagery. In the aftermath, it became increasingly difficult to distinguish which dead worlds on the Ghoul star's periphery had been murdered by those later Imperial retributions, and which had already been hollowed out by older, stranger forces. The scars of macro-cannon barrages lie over more enigmatic wounds. A planet whose primary hive had already been emptied of inhabitants by some pre-Imperial disaster might later have had its outer settlements blasted to ruin by vengeful battleships, neatly obscuring the nature of the first catastrophe beneath the footprint of the second. Among the more ambiguous actors in that era were the Ashenclaws, a splintered brotherhood of space marines whose origins lay in the same gene forge as the Raven Guard, but whose loyalties drifted ever further from Terra's orbit. Fleeing censure and motivated by their own harsh pragmatism, they carved out a brutal pocket empire in the region, brushing the Ghoul stars. They claimed half-forgotten human worlds and fortified them, establishing a network of fortress redoubts and hidden anchorages from which they could launch raids and take what they needed to endure. In another part of the galaxy, such a force might have fashioned itself into conquerors, erecting monuments and codifying rule. In the shadow of the Ghoul stars, the Ashenclaws became scavengers. Their strongholds were designed less to project power than to weather sieges that might never come, but which they clearly feared. Their fleets hunted not for glory, but for supplies, for recruits, for the means to keep their cells alive in a region where reliable allies were scarce, and the environment itself seemed hostile. They plundered other human enclaves, trading protection for fealty, and abandoning worlds that could not pay. They fought Xenos, things for territory, and then, more tellingly, abandoned that same territory when the price of keeping it grew too high. Their existence is an example writ in ceramite and blood. Even the angels of death, when forced to operate on the Ghoul star's fringes, become raiders and reavers instead of crusaders. Death was not the end of those dead human worlds. The Imperium is a scavenger empire as much as a conqueror, and the adepts of Mars hunger for lost designs. The whisper that a given Ghoul star's system once hosted a Dark Age enclave is enough to send an explorator fleet questing outward. Rogue traders with letters of marked by sigils from the Ordo Xenos and the Fabricator General have risked everything to pick the bones of those failed utopias. They go in search of intact template constructs, of repositories of pre-imperial science, of vaults full of weapons deemed too dangerous, even by the standards of a galaxy steeped in atrocity. Again and again, such expeditions do not return. Sometimes a few astropathic echoes make it back through the screaming madness of the warp, fragments of images or half-phrased pleas seared into the minds of receiving psychers. A vox picture of a city whose proportions are subtly wrong, its streets subtly curving into spirals that should be impossible. A line of catalog code recited in a voice that is no longer recognizably human, cycling through colony designation numbers long erased from current records. A choir that begins chanting coordinates before abruptly falling silent, as if cut off by some great hand. The Ordos collate these things, mark entire sectors as prohibited, and add more purity seals to doors that were already sealed many times. The bitter truth is that those early enclaves were, in their own terms, paradises, self-contained systems where atmospheric controls kept the air sweet and temperate, where Medici engines could purge sickness, where food printers and nutrient cycles ensured no one need ever go hungry. The men who founded them believed they had finally mastered the cruel equation of survival. No gods, no distant tyrant on Terra, only man and his machines, perfectly balanced. Their citizens looked up at their dim suns and saw not a threat, but a challenge already answered. They cast the term Eden into code, building enclaves designed to operate for millennia, without external interference, wombs of steel and plasteel in which humanity might finally live without fear. To view those places now, where they can still be reached, is to see that dream in its most obscene inversion. The habdomes stand, their shells unbreached, but their gardens are dust. The maintenance servitors walk prescribed patterns through empty corridors, performing tasks whose purpose has long been lost. The oversight cogitators still tick and hum, regulating power output and climate cycles for inhabitants who do not exist. On some worlds, Vox systems continue to broadcast standard civic announcements into dead air, reminding no one to attend no assemblies at set hours. The systems work. The promise of comfort and longevity is still technically viable. The humans that those systems were designed to serve are gone. It should be a simple thing, from the pitiless standpoint of terror, to reclaim such bounty. The Imperium is always hungry for habitable planets, for manufactoria already half-built, for infrastructure that can be press-ganged into its tithe cycles. Every year, the Administratum signs off on colonization attempts to far harsher environments, lifeless rocks that must be ground into viability by centuries of backbreaking labor. Yet the dead worlds of the Ghoul stars are not queued for reoccupation. There are no great colonist convoys inbound, no crusade fleets tasked with placing them under the Aquila. Instead, there are quarantines, warning buoys, and the occasional quiet order to render a particularly tempting world uninhabitable by fire rather than risk anyone setting foot upon it again. The reason is found in those records that were not successfully erased, in scattered data shards and the reluctant testimony of survivors. The same message emerges. Whatever cooled the first populations is not gone. It is merely quiescent. In some cases, later survey teams report subtle anomalies, the sudden reactivation of local systems when human biosigns are detected, the spontaneous blooming of new structures over old, the appearance of unfamiliar sigils where none existed before. On other worlds, nothing overt occurs, yet members of survey squads begin to dream the same dreams, to speak words in their sleep that cannot be matched to any known tongue. The more cautious commanders withdraw at once, burning their landing sites behind them and consigning their findings to inquisitorial data crypts. The more arrogant do not withdraw. Their fleets join the growing list of names marked missing in the depths of the Ghoul stars. Death creates vacancies, and the galaxy abhors a vacuum. The worlds once owned by those forgotten human empires did not remain empty forever. Something moved in, or perhaps something that had always been present merely extended its claws. There are now Xenos polities, spectral realms, and predator species that use those silent cities as lairs and hunting grounds. Some are entirely unknown to imperial taxonomies, their biologies and technologies incompatible with the careful categories in which the Adeptus Mechanicus likes to arrange its fears. Others are perversions of familiar threats, Necron dynasties, whose madness is expressed in meat rather than in sterile annihilation, or star-born horrors whose appetites run not to biomass, but to patterns and memories. The arcs of human ambition traced into the Ghoul star's end, almost without exception, in dust. The empire that thought itself divine has learned to skirt that region, assigning watchmen and wardens to its border, rather than attempting to raise its standard at the region's heart. Those early colonists, with their faith in machines and templates, are long vanished. Their ruins now belong to things that regard mankind with the same cold disinterest that the colonists once reserved for the worlds they reshaped. The story of the Ghoul stars is not only a tale of human death, it is the story of humanity's dreams of mastery turned to mausoleums, and of a galaxy that did not even pause to notice when those dreams went dark. There are tomes within the sealed libraries of the Ordo Xenos that no sane man would ever request. Bound in flayed skin or warded brass, they are catalogues in only the loosest sense, compiled from salvaged logs, kill reports, and deathbed confessions of those who have gone too close to the Ghoul stars and lived long enough to scratch their experiences down. The Magos Xenologies, who tend these records, do not pretend they have produced a complete bestiary. At best, they have drawn a few shuddering sketches in the margin of a nightmare that refuses to resolve into clear shape. Their language betrays their unease. Even the most clinical reports slip into words usually reserved for the warp. Creatures are described as so alien as to seem supernatural, their behaviors as impossible to reconcile with known evolutionary frameworks. The writers reach for the categories with which the Imperium is most comfortable: predator, parasite, hive form, warp entity. Again and again, the beings that crawl and coil through the Ghoul stars slide out of those boxes, forcing the adepts to resort to hesitant metaphors and half-remembered myth. When a civilization that deals daily with demons and living gods begins to call something supernatural, it is because it cannot find a more precise word. Among the few Xenos breeds given a name in those grim catalogues, the Scythor fiends are perhaps the most infamous. In the earliest references, they are called bat-things, winged humanoids glimpsed against the starfields on the edges of Auspex range, their forms wreathed in the shimmering halos of some kind of reactive field. Subsequent encounters refine the picture. They are tall, narrow-boned creatures, their frames all whipcord muscle and cartilage, with membranes stretched between elongated limbs that serve both as wings in weak gravities and as sensory sails, rippling in unseen currents. Their eyes are faceted like an insect's and black as the void, their skulls crested with arrays of crystal growths that glitter with internal light. These crystalline structures are not ornament. They are the visible tips of the Scythor arsenal. Imperial boarding parties that have reached compromised Scythor vessels report weapon emplacements grown directly out of the hull, clusters of quartz-like nodules that hum and vibrate before releasing invisible pulses. Armor plates struck by those pulses fractures into razor-edged shards, bursting outward in clouds of glittering death. Infantry, unlucky enough to be caught in the open, are sliced apart in a storm of high-velocity fragments that leave no coherent corpse, only a smear of red and the hiss of cooling ceramite. Survivors liken the effect to being inside a frag charge made of glass. More distinctive still are the silver discs. These are hand-thrown weapons the size of a man's palm, mirror-bright on both faces and perfectly balanced. In flight, they make no sound that human ears can register. Only when they strike do they reveal their nature, shattering into a flurry of monomolecular splinters that seek out flesh and exposed components with malicious precision. Imperial armorers have not been able to reproduce their material composition. Under magnification, the shards appear to shift between crystalline and metallic states, as if undecided what they truly are. It is in space, however, that the Scythor show their most disquieting talents. Their ships are not grand line vessels or city-sized cruisers, but lean blade-shaped craft optimized for ambush. Navy tacticians have classed the most commonly encountered pattern as a pinion, for the wing-like profile it presents when momentarily caught in auger sweeps. These ships are rarely seen except in the instant before they strike. They slide through void and warp with uncanny stealth, slipping past sensor nets that would have no trouble detecting an escort squadron or a pirate hulk. Entire scout flotillas have vanished after reporting what they believed to be only a fleeting distortion, a pattern of shadows where no mass should be. When the Imperium has tried to take the war to them, it has found itself grasping at spectres. The center of recorded Scythor activity has long been a gas giant, named in Mechanicus records, with a string of numbers and glyphs, now more commonly rendered in Low Gothic as the Grave Core. It hangs in a system whose star is already half dead, a bloated planet banded in dirty greys and sickly blues. Around it, at distances that form no easily decipherable pattern, orbit a multitude of artificial constructs, ring segments, shattered platforms, clusters of habitat modules welded together in strange, asymmetrical stacks. From a distance, these objects resemble the usual clutter of any long-inhabited system, the accumulated stations and waypoints of a spacefaring civilization. Closer inspection dispels that comfort. Many of the structures are clearly wrong, their lines too organic, their proportions subtly unsettling, as if they were grown rather than built. Those that conform more closely to human or mechanicus design patterns share a more disturbing trait. They are empty. Boarding actions that have penetrated their hulls report chambers still pressurized and lit, life support systems running on degraded but functioning power grids, cogitator stacks murmuring to themselves in forgotten binaric, but no inhabitants, no Scythor, no slaves, no corpses. The debris fields that halo the gravecore tell fragmentary stories all of their own. There are shipwrecks among them, hulls rent open, not by conventional weapons, but by forces that seem to have turned sections of their structure against the rest. There are slabs of armor grown through with crystalline filaments. There are frozen clouds of shattered matter that might once have been habitats, now reduced to glittering dust. Those who stand at an observation blister and look out upon that clutter feel a peculiar sensation of being watched, not from any single point, but from the entire scene at once, as if the system itself resents the gaze. The Scyther are not alone in that haunted region. Their infamy is matched, in certain narrow circles, by other apex predators whose names surface only in marginal notes and mission debrief addenda. The Togoran bloodreeks, for instance, are mentioned only a handful of times in accessible archives, yet each mention is attached to casualty figures that would shame a full-scale orc incursion. They are described as pack hunters native to the shattered moon fields of the Togoran reaches, leathery quadrupeds with mouths that hinge too wide and sensory organs that taste electromagnetic flux as easily as scent on the air. One veteran of the Death Watch likened being stalked by bloodreeks to being nibbled to death by the shadows themselves. They do not charge en masse, but peel their prey apart over many nights, stripping away sentries and stragglers until the core of a force is left sleep-starved and surrounded, fighting phantoms that never show their full forms. The bloodreeks are not counted among the great powers of the Ghoul stars, no more than feral beasts, yet they are vicious enough to justify permanent monitoring assets on Togoran's fringe, lest their hunting patterns shift outward into more populated lanes. Beyond such bestial horrors lie constructs of a far older malignance. In the bitter reaches where the Ghoul stars bleed into other lawless halos stands the so-called Bone Kingdom of Drazak, a realm claimed by one of the half-forgotten Necron dynasties. The Necrons are known across the galaxy as ruthless, passionless machine intelligences, their legions marching with silent precision to the dictates of logic and long-laid plans. On Drazak, something went wrong. The tomb complexes there are not the pristine sepulchres found elsewhere. Their lines are broken, their sigils defaced from within. Great pyramidal structures list at odd angles, their support pylons warped into grotesque curves. The streets that thread between them are piled high with ossified remains, femurs and ribs, vertebrae and skulls, arranged in drifts and stacks, as if some mad wind had blown the dead into meaningless dunes. Here and there, the bones have been crudely wired together into effigies of fleshly forms, mockeries of life that sway on rusted chains or stand canted in alcoves like saints in a deranged reliquary. It is upon those streets that the flayed ones stalk. These are Necrons cursed by a viral glitch of soul and code, condemned to experience phantom hunger for the meat they abandoned when their race traded bodies of flesh for necrodermis shells. On other worlds, they are terrors from the dark, appearing from nowhere to drag victims away, their metallic claws slick with stolen blood. On Drazak, they have an entire kingdom in which to indulge their deranged appetites. Witness testimonies, few and fragmented, speak of metal bodies draped in tattered strips of desiccated flesh, scrapings torn from whatever unfortunates blunder onto that cursed world. They describe packs of flayed ones fighting amongst themselves over scraps of rotting meat, tearing at each other like starving canids, even though they have no need for sustenance. They speak of Necron lords who once commanded legions reduced to gibbering huntsmen, their regal forms smeared with ages-old gore, their minds looping through the same cycle of butcheries again and again. It is a spectacle that horrifies even seasoned inquisitors, because it represents a fundamental violation of certainty. If such creatures, once thought the pinnacle of soulless rationality, can fall into that kind of madness, what hope is there for anything more fragile? In that sense, the flayed ones of Drazak are not merely a threat. They are a metaphor made manifest. The Ghoul stars warp not only flesh but purpose, machine-pure entities built to think in perfect cold calculus, become obsessed with the messy business of meat. They drape themselves in muscles that cannot function, covet organs that cannot integrate with their frames. They hunger without stomachs. It is as if the region itself whispers into the gaps of their programming, introducing a note of irrationality that spreads like a taint. That this should occur in creatures whose minds are supposedly shielded from the warp by alien science suggests the influence at work is not of the kind the Imperium is used to recognizing. If such corruptions can afflict the ancient, then what chance do the merely mortal have? There are legends, half excised from the historical record, of entities blamed for the cataclysms that occasionally erupt from the Ghoul stars into surrounding space. The most notorious of these is the event later called the Pale Wasting, a plague of unknown form that scoured world after world in a wave of annihilation. Those few lines that escaped censure speak not of a simple disease, but of star-spawned contagion and nightmare engines, of something that arrived from the Ghoul stars and rewrote the fates of entire sectors. The authorship of that horror is variously laid at the feet of Thexian constructs, or of some older species whose name has not been preserved, only a trailing series of consonants in a dead explorer's log. Space Marines who fought along those burning frontiers, warriors of several chapters whose banners now stand silent in forgotten chapels, described their foes not as armies but as phenomena. They fought minds that were also spores that propagated through thought and memory. They destroyed machines that refused to die, whose parts sought one another across battlefields as if guided by an invisible will. They watched men look at something in the sky and simply fall apart, not physically but conceptually, their identities unraveling faster than any Medicae or chaplain could arrest. When such records reached Terra, those who read them reached again for that word, supernatural, and this in a culture that daily contends with the warp and its denizens. The distinction lies in familiarity. Demons are terrifying, but they are known quantities. They have categories, sigils, hierarchies. The Imperium has its own cruel rules, its own logics that can be studied even if they cannot be tamed. The beings and phenomena of the Ghoul stars, by contrast, defy incorporation into any existing schema. They are not merely powerful, they are wrong, intrusions from a conceptual direction the Imperium is ill-equipped to even describe. Among the scattered logs of frontier garrisons and lost research bases, one finds too many casual mentions of local fauna, whose natures would be considered aberrant anywhere else in the galaxy. There are creatures that feed on light, absorbing it through translucent skins until entire valleys lie in perfect blackness. There are organisms that do not metabolize matter in any conventional sense, but instead draw sustenance from the electromagnetic chatter of a settlement, the static buildup of human activity. As towns fall silent, these things starve, growing thin and desperate. Their howls a shrieking feedback that strips enamel from teeth and sanity from minds. On some worlds, the predator and prey distinction collapses entirely. Entire ecosystems seem structured not around survival, but torment. Harmless-looking plankton drift through the upper atmospheres of gas giants, leaving trails of color that burn after images into the retinas of those who look up at the wrong moment. Within days, those afflicted find their dreams invaded by ghostly impressions of alien skies. They waste away as more and more of their attention is siphoned into those visions, until eventually they walk out into the wastes, mouths moving soundlessly as they chase something only they can see. On another planet, lichen-like growths record and replay sounds, trapping screams and pleas for help in a constant echo that wears down the resolve of anyone tasked with cleansing the infestation. In such environments, simple settlement becomes self-sabotage. Human presence is not merely preyed upon, it is incorporated into the local systems, used as fuel or building material, or simply as a vector for expanding some inscrutable pattern. Even hardened regiments of the Astra Militarum, raised on death worlds and battlefields, falter when confronted with threats that they cannot shoot or bomb into compliance, that do not even appear to notice their opposition until some threshold of interference is crossed, and a response occurs that no Tactica manual has ever prepared them for. It is from the sum of these experiences, from bestiary entries that read more like exorcism manuals and ecological surveys that feel like autopsies of deranged gods, that the Imperium has derived its current approach to the Ghoul stars. It does not send grand crusades to plant banners in that soil. There are no triumphal processions planned for the pacification of sectors that no sane man wants to claim. Instead, the High Lords and their shadowy advisors assign watchers. Entire chapters of the Adeptus Astartes are chained to the edge of that darkness, ordered to stare into it forever and report what moves. Deathwatch fortresses are seeded along likely emergence paths, their kill teams trained not to defeat, but to identify, contain, and, if necessary, die buying time for others to burn infected systems from afar. These are not the tasks that heroes dream of when they don ceramite and take the oath of moment. They are vigil chores, endless and thankless, yet they are all that stands between the inhabitants of the wider Imperium and the outlander horrors that crawl within that graveyard of suns. The Ghoul stars are populated, abundantly so, but not in any way that comforts the human soul. Their natives are inhabitants out of nightmare, and it has fallen to a handful of sentinels on the galaxy's ragged fringe to make sure that nightmare does not wake and stride more fully into the light. There exists a brotherhood of the Adeptus Astartes, whose duty is not to wage glorious crusades in the light of the Astronomicon, but to stand upon its fading edge and count the dying suns. They are the Death Spectres, and their name is not poetic excess. They are as much custodians of unquiet graveyards as they are angels of death, a chapter born from dark gene seed in the cursed 13th founding, and bound from their first oath to a single command from the High Lords of Terror. Watch the Ghoul stars, and do not look away. Their fortress monastery does not cling to some verdant shrine world or proud hive bastion. It hangs over Occludus, a world that might once have been a garden and is now little more than a cinder, drifting just beyond the formal borders of the Imperium. Occludus circles a weak, pale star whose light barely reaches the planet's airless surface. The only brightness there comes from the fires of the fortress itself, a cathedral of adamant and gunmetal, its walls thick with gun ports and sensor arrays, its inner halls clad in bone and glass. From that vantage, the Death Spectres stare outward toward the Ghoul stars, and inward toward the Imperium that has largely forgotten them. They are Raven Guard in lineage, but the legacy of Corax has been eroded and repurposed by the demands of their vigil. Like their progenitors, They favor stealth, shadow, and sudden violence, but their temperament is more funereal. Their heraldry is stark and pallid, bone, white and sable, their armor decorated not with banners of conquest, but with tally marks of worlds watched and threats averted. They do not speak of victory, they speak of postponement. Within their fortress monastery, the living walk alongside the preserved dead. Battle brothers who have fallen in the chapter's service are not interred in simple sarcophagi and forgotten. Their bodies are mummified, their armor lacquered and sealed, and then set to stand watch in the halls, lining the walls of Strategia and chapel alike. Their hollow eye lenses gaze eternally toward the star screens and augur pits, a constant reminder that to serve the Death Spectres is to be married to death even long after the last breath has been stolen. At the core of their command, sanctum sits a thing that has no place in any sane imperial doctrine. The glass throne, sometimes named in older records as Shariax. It is not a construct of human design. Its frame is a spiderwork of black iron, but its seat and back are slabs of crystal shot through with veins of unknown, slowly shifting color. When a man sits upon it, the surface clouds and then clears, swallowing his outline in refracted light. The artifact was taken at great cost from the fringe of the Ghoul stars in an age when the chapter was newly forged and more prone to risk. It has never been returned. For the chapter master of the Death Spectres, the glass throne is both burden and oracle. By tradition and dire necessity, he ascends its steps regularly, shedding his helm and gauntlets before seating himself upon its cold surface. When he does, the throne drinks of him. Flesh sags, hair whitens, the iron-hard frame of an Astartes shrivels fraction by fraction as the crystal feeds. In exchange, visions well up from somewhere beyond time and distance, star patterns in flux, fleets moving like motes in a colossal bloodstream, the flare of unnatural energies at the edge of the map, like lightning behind a distant storm front. These images do not come as words, nor even as clear pictures. They come as tides of knowing that the chapter master must interpret and translate into orders for his warriors. The cost is obvious. Every vision consumes a span of his life. No Death Spectres. Chapter Master dies cleanly in battle or quietly at his duties. Each is drained to a husk atop that alien seat, their bodies eventually lifted down, hollow-eyed and half-mummified already, to join the ranks of honored dead that line the vision chambers. The chapter accepts this without complaint. In their rites and catechisms, death is not an end, but a posture. They see themselves as custodians of a cosmic charnel house, and the glass throne as the altar upon which they offer their strength to hold that house's doors shut. Yet even their ceaseless, morbid watch is not deemed sufficient by terror. Parallel to their vigil runs another, more secretive one. On the far side of the Ghoul star's border, concealed in the shadow of a nameless planetoid, lies Fort Pikeman, a fortress of the Death Watch, where the Death Spectres are a full chapter shaped around a single hateful horizon. The Death Watch are an anthology of others' nightmares, a brotherhood drawn from 100 chapters and bound by oaths to the Ordo Xenos. Fort Pikeman is one of their most isolated bastions, its garrisons cut off from the usual flow of reinforcements by sheer distance and by bureaucratic convenience. It is easier in the taupe corridors of power to forget such places exist and to remember them only when their astropathic choirs send back words like breach or emergent threat. Within Fort Pikeman's armored guts, kill teams drill without end. Their walls bear not the iconography of one gene line, but a riot of devices. Crimson fists, howling wolves, sunbursts, and stylized predators. All are united under the black and silver of the Death Watch and under the simple, brutal clarity of their mission. They are to watch the traffic that brushes the Ghoul Star's fringe, to intercept any vessel that shows signs of taint, to hunt down and exterminate any organism or construct that looks as though it walked out of a Ghoul Star's nightmare and refused to go back. When other Imperial forces report contact with entities that defy classification, it is often Fort Peakman that receives the call. Sometimes they answer with surgical strikes, boarding torpedoes, slamming into corrupted hulls, and disgorging grim, silent warriors. Sometimes the only answer they can give is recommendation for total annihilation by naval assets. Exterminatus is a blunt instrument, but there are phenomena for which no precise tool exists. Ranging between the Death Spectres' static vigil and the Death Watch's hidden hunts are the nomad predation chapters, battle brothers who have long since traded palaces and homeworlds for roaming fleets and endless horizons. Among these, the Carcharodon's Astra and the Angel's Erythrian are most often named in the same breath as the Ghoul Stars. The Carcharodons, lean and scarred, move through the darkness like the sharks of Old Terra's ancient seas, striking without warning and departing with equal swiftness. The Angel's Erythrian favor, blood-red panoply, and harsh penitential customs, their ships flying no colors save those that mark them as outcasts and necessary monsters. These chapters drift through or near the Ghoul Stars on trajectories that make little sense to Imperial logisticians. They appear in savage systems, offering their blades to whatever loyal authority remains, then fade back toward the eastern halo. There are rumors of parley between them and the Ashenclaws, those wayward kin who carved a human pocket empire on the Ghoul Star's rim. There are whispered accounts of exchanges of prisoners and relics in lightless void harbors, of information traded at gunpoint and of grudges postponed in the face of greater unspoken threats. It is an ecosystem of exile and predation, a web of temporary alliances stitched over abysses. For the human population stranded on the Ghoul Star's fringe, the presence of such warriors is not the blessing it might be elsewhere. Sentinel chapters and nomad predators alike have priorities that do not align with those of ordinary Imperial citizens. Their first duty is not to hold individual worlds, but to contain currents and infestations that could spread across many. To them, a frontier agri-colony is a useful listening post and a convenient pool of recruits, not a sacred trust. When a threat emerges that demands sacrifice, it is often these marginal populations who are quietly marked for abandonment. There are too many instances to count where a warning from Death Spectres' augur arrays has led to astropathic orders being sent to a string of minor worlds. Prepare for evacuation, endure until relieved, stand fast in the Emperor's name. Relief does not come. Instead, orbital bombardment signs light the skies as some. Nascent horror is burned out of existence, along with the hive or manufactorum where it took root. The chapter's chaplains exhort their brothers to see this as necessary. Better that 1 million die now than 1 billion later. On Occludus, that arithmetic is carved into stone. Not all Imperial responses to the Ghoul Stars are static. There have been rare instances where the Imperium's answer has been to plunge more deeply into that darkness, to seek understanding by force of arms. One of the most notable of these was the Covenant of Ikale, when the Marines' errant chapter bound itself by oaths of war and exploration to rogue trader Siahad-Nekal and his vast armada. Together, they voyaged into the Ghoul Stars, a full chapter, and its allied flotilla turned into a single, prowling spearhead. For decades, by Imperial count, they vanished from the usual charts. Their banners did not appear in the rolls of major campaigns elsewhere. Instead, sporadic reports filtered back from the eastern. Halo, sightings of ultramarine-hued ceramite fighting alongside mercantile vessels against unnamed Xenos. Astropathic impressions of towering cathedrals drifting through voids choked with crystalline debris. with garbled transmissions, hinting at discoveries so strange that even the explorators hesitated to describe them. When the Marines errant finally emerged, their numbers were diminished, their fleet much reduced, their officers marked in flesh and soul by what they had seen. They brought back artifacts and warnings, new glyphs for unknown species added to the Ordo Xenos codices. They did not bring back comfort. Their chronicles of the Covenant are fragmentary and often heavily censored, as if even they do not wish to preserve too much of what they witnessed. Others have plunged in with more straightforward intent: to destroy, not to learn. High Marshal Helbrecht of the Black Templars, ever drawn to the most arduous and uncompromising battles, led one such crusade. It was aimed squarely at the Sithor fiends, whose predations along trade routes and bloody ambushes of Imperial shipping had become intolerable. For years, Helbrecht's crusade waged war across the fringes of the Sithor realm, purging outlying nests, burning their grown shipyards, and shattering their crystalline weapons. Each victory pushed the campaign closer toward the core systems centered on the Grave Core that haunted gas giant wreathed in derelict platforms and haunted stations. When at last the crusade fought its way into that heart, searing a path through what defenses remained, the warriors of the Eternal Crusade expected their greatest battle. They found instead only absence. Stations that should have thronged with bat-winged Xenos were utterly deserted. Docking spars were empty. The platforms around the gas giant drifted in eerie silence. Initial boarding actions found no bodies, no signs of panic or evacuation. It was as if the Scythor and their thralls had simply ceased to exist. 4. Veterans hardened by centuries of brutal warfare, that emptiness was a deeper horror than any desperate last stand could have been. An enemy that fights can be understood. An enemy that simply vanishes leaves only questions. And in the shadow of the Ghoul stars, questions are often more dangerous than foes. Of some endeavors, even that much cannot be truthfully said. There are chapters whose paths have led them toward the Ghoul stars, and whose subsequent histories are blank. The Iron Crusaders, a chapter little recorded even in the annals of the Adeptus Astartes, are known primarily for their heading. Their fleets were last logged burning coreward from the garbled region toward the eastern halo, banners raised in grim determination. After that, there is only silence. In later millennia, the Black Templars themselves would again turn their gaze that way. In the era of the Great Rift's birth, the Oparian Crusade drove eastward, a spear of faith and ceramite aimed into the Ghoul. Stars. Its last confirmed deeds are battles on the threshold of that region. Beyond that, there are only vox echoes and ecclesiarchal proclamations insisting that the crusade continues its holy work, somewhere out in the dark, where no living astropath can quite locate it. This is the nature of sentinel duty, on the edge of nothing. It is a slow martyrdom, both for brothers in armor and for the institutions that command them. Chapters like the Death Spectres and fortresses like Pikemen operate on the thinnest of logistical threads, far from the easy resupply and political patronage enjoyed by those who war closer to terror. Their pleas for reinforcement compete with 1,000 more urgent-seeming crises nearer to the heart of the Imperium. Their armories rust and are patched. Their gene seed tithe quotas are overlooked. They become self-reliant, insular, increasingly shaped by the thing they watch. Their rituals grow stranger. Their chaplains preach to congregations who already consider themselves half-damned by proximity. They live under the constant, unspoken knowledge that the Ghoul stars have flared outward before. Somewhere in their sealed libraria and restricted vaults lie accounts of a time when something from that region pushed past all these sentinels and bled its horror into more settled space. The words pale wasting occur in such texts, accompanied by casualty figures written in hesitant, almost disbelieving script. Entire sectors shuddered then, and a dozen chapters bled themselves white, putting the horror back into its cage. The guardians of the Ghoul stars do not know exactly what it was. They are not trusted with that knowledge. They only know that it happened once, and that their whole existence is now a bulwark against it happening again. To understand why Terra is willing to maintain such costly, half-forgotten garrisons on a frontier it pretends does not exist, one must leave the silent fortresses and drifting fleets and look back in time to that buried catastrophe when the Ghoul stars truly bared their teeth and the galaxy nearly choked on the wound. That event, scrubbed from most histories and remembered only in fragments and forbidden stele, is now spoken of by those who dare as the Pale Wasting. There was a time, long before the cicatrix tore the galaxy in half, when the Imperium tried to pretend that its greatest threats were each other. The age that scholars call the Nova Terra Interregnum saw the realm of mankind fracture, not under alien assault, but under the weight of its own arrogance. Ultramarines and Imperial Fist's successors bled for rival claimants to the same golden throne. The Administratum served multiple masters, and tithe fleets sailed past one another in sullen silence. The Astronomicon still burned, but its light shone upon an Imperium divided into feuding sub-empires. It was into that distracted, self-wounded beast that the Ghoul stars chose to sink their teeth. The later years of the 34th millennium are a blur of contradictory records and carefully redacted campaign logs. Among the scattered fragments, the same phrase recurs often enough to forge its own grim identity: the Pale Wasting. It is never explained outright. Instead, it lies coiled beneath euphemism. Sectors along the eastern and northeastern marches are recorded as blighted. There are tithe registers that suddenly convert prosperous worlds to simple numerals indicating total loss. Minor noble lines vanish from genealogical records, their heraldry filed away under quiet obituaries. Only when one digs into the sealed margins of Ordo Xenos and Ordo Historicus vaults does the truth begin to show through. Something came out of the Ghoul stars while the Imperium glared inward, and it began to eat. Even those hidden records do not agree on what exactly the Pale Wasting was. Some speak of a star-spawned plague, a contagion that fell from the void like poisoned light and spread from world to world, with a speed that mocked quarantine. Whole populations are described as withering in days, their flesh turning pale and translucent before sloughing away, their bones dissolving, their shadows burning themselves into rock and ferrocrete like brands. Other accounts barely mention disease at all, instead fixating on nightmare engines that devoured entire systems. These are described as vast constructs drifting between the stars, surrounded by swarms of smaller, self-replicating machines that stripped ships and orbital platforms to bare frames before moving on, leaving nothing but the echo of their passage in Auspex logs. It is the conjunction of those two lines of description that makes Imperial savants uneasy. The Imperium is well acquainted with plagues. Nurgle's gifts have rotted their way across countless hive levels, and mundane pathogens have done what Bolter and Lasfire could not. The Adeptus Mechanicus, in turn, know far more about runaway machine constructs and feral logic, engines, than they are willing to admit. Both dangers have names and protocols. The Pale Wasting is remembered as both, and as something more. It is spoken of as a plague that acted with machine precision, choosing its targets along lines that matched fleet movements and warp currents, and as engines that behaved like infections, infiltrating cogitator systems and biological tissue with equal facility. To see an event described in both biological and mechanical terms at once, and by sources that are normally keen to separate such things, is deeply unnatural. The scale of the response offers another measure of the terror it inspired.
Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Support really helps.
The Nova Marines, stalwart scions of Guilliman, were among the first to answer the call. Their deployment alone would have signified that the threat was judged worthy of serious attention. Yet the scattered references that endure make it clear that they were not alone. At least 11 other chapters of the Adeptus Astartes are named, some obscure, some more renowned, all diverted from their own wars to form a patchwork bulwark along the spreading front. Behind them marched regiments of the Astra Militarum and crusader hosts of the Ecclesiarchy, while void shields flared over forge worlds as the Adeptus Mechanicus prepared apocalyptic contingencies. For all that initial clarity, the trail soon vanishes into smoke. Those other chapters mentioned in early mustering orders rarely reappear in later histories. Their banners do not receive the usual marginal notations in the great rolls of honor maintained on Terra and Macragge. Their gene seed tithe records grow patchy and then halt. In some cases, their homeworlds are listed as lost, or their fortress monasteries as deserted, with no explanation given. It is as if they burned themselves out, like candles held too close to a furnace, consumed entirely in the effort of stemming whatever horror issued from the Ghoul stars. The Nova Marines alone emerge with any traceable continuity, and even their survival is cloaked in silence. Within the Nova Marines' own chapter records, such as they are available to outsiders, there is a conspicuous gap. Where one would expect a campaign eternalized in stone and adamantine, there is a discrete absence. Their roll of early battle honors skirts the period with a speed that borders on indecent. It is on Terra, not in their own halls, that the single most explicit acknowledgement exists. In a quiet transept of a lesser-known basilica, surrounded by monuments to victories that the Administratum has deemed of more public utility, stands an ancient stone stele. Its surface is worn by time and incense smoke, but the words can still be made out. It praises the courage of the Nova Marines against an unnamed horror from the Ghoul stars, and beseeches the Emperor that such a trial never be repeated. No more detail is carved. The stele is less a proclamation than a scar. It is from such scars and fragments that later commentators have tried to infer the true nature of the pale wasting. The term star-spawned plague suggests a pathogen of some kind, but not one that follows the crude, blind logic of mundane disease. There are hints that entire star systems sickened before their worlds did, that suns dimmed or flared unpredictably as the plague passed, their emissions shifting into spectra that drove men and auspex arrays alike to distraction. There are reports of void ships whose crews never showed any outward sign of infection, yet whose hulls softened and ran like wax under the wrong kind of light. Some radical xenologists have speculated that the pale wasting may have been a contagion that targeted not flesh, but the very patterns that underpin matter and energy, rewriting the rules under which they interact. Others, more cautious but no less disturbed, have drawn parallels to mimetic incursions and warp-tainted thought forms. Perhaps, they suggest, the plague was not a germ in any conventional sense, but an idea seeded from the Ghoul stars, a self-propagating pattern that once observed could not be unseen, that spread from mind to mind and system to system, dragging physical reality after it like a cloak. Such speculations are tolerated only at the outer edges of Ordo Xenos discourse, for fear that the act of theorizing might itself echo whatever process is being described. The nightmare engines that marched in tandem with that unseen sickness are no easier to categorize. The term appears in after-action reports from multiple worlds, often as the last intelligible phrase before the transmission falls into static. On one frontier planet, a planetary defense force officer describes an object the size of a lesser moon drifting into orbit, surrounded by a halo of glittering debris that moved with uncanny cohesion. As it passed over, Vox networks screamed, ceramic materials pulsed like living tissue, and the sky itself seemed to ripple. Ground batteries fired until their barrels overheated and sagged, but the shells vanished before impact, swallowed by an invisible distortion a short distance from the thing's skin. Elsewhere, Imperial Navy logs speak of vast structures rising out of gas giant atmospheres, shedding layers of condensed vapor that coalesced into smaller darting machines. These smaller constructs latched onto ships, not to tear their hulls open, but to infiltrate. Devices went mad, gravity plating inverted. Men found themselves walking toward walls that kept receding, caught in loops of space that should not have been possible. Those who tried to look too closely at the machine's cause reported vertigo and nausea, as if their senses were trying to reject the form pinned before them. The Adeptus Mechanicus, when confronted with such phenomena, might be expected to reach for their own heretical past, to mutter about the men of iron and the dark age of artificial intelligences that turned upon their makers. Yet the nightmare engines of the Pale Wasting do not fit comfortably even there. They do not behave like pure logic turned predatory. They do not optimize. They meander, change shape, interact with biology and architecture as if testing them for aesthetic compatibility rather than strategic value. The most disturbing theories suggest that the Pale Wasting represented a synthesis, a union of Xenos biology and machine intelligence into entities that did not see any distinction between flesh and metal, between thought and mass. To such a thing, a human world and a starship would be equally raw material. Whatever form the horror took, the Imperium eventually claimed victory. It always does. The Administratum records the Pale Wasting as a crisis contained, a wound cauterized. The Ghoul stars remain on the map, their name unchanged. The sectors that burned under the star-spawned plague's light are listed as stabilized, their surviving worlds folded back into tithe cycles and crusade routes. If one trusts only the public ledgers, it would seem that the nightmare came and was beaten back, like any other Xenos incursion. Yet the signs suggest otherwise. The first and most obvious sign is that no serious attempt has ever been made to pacify the Ghoul stars themselves. If the Imperium truly believed that it had destroyed the source of the Pale Wasting, there would have been no question of subsequent crusades to hammer a chain of fortresses into its heart. That is the Imperial way. Here instead, there was only the sealing off of a wound that still festers beneath the bandage. Patrols along the fringe grew tighter. Watch fortresses like pikemen were reinforced. Chapters were assigned to permanent sentinel duty rather than to triumphant follow-through. The victory, such as it was, appears to have consisted of forcing the thing back into its cage, not of killing it. The second sign lies in the way the records themselves have been handled. The Imperium is not squeamish about its own bloodshed. It celebrates martyrdom and apocalypse. It carves depictions of genocidal victories into the walls of its cathedrals and raises statues to men who ordered the scouring of entire subsectors. For such a regime to deliberately bury an event requires reasons beyond simple embarrassment. The Inquisition, with its usual joyless thoroughness, appears to have led the purge. Whole strata of data concerning the Pale Wasting have been excised, not only from public archives, but from Mechanicus noospheres and even Astartes Libraria. What little is left bears the fingerprints of careful selection. One rational motive for such erasure is panic prevention. The Pale Wasting, by its very nature, may have been so fundamentally destabilizing that the High Lords and their Shadow Councils deemed it safest to pretend it had never happened. If worlds can sicken without warning under the breath of an invisible star-born plague, if reality itself can be bent and harvested by engines that drift in from the dark, then the promise of Imperial protection becomes a hollow joke. Better, from the point of view of control, to speak of generic Xenos incursions and nameless heresies than to admit that there are threats against which armored regiments and cathedral fleets are at best temporary palliatives. Another, more troubling possibility is that the Pale Wasting revealed something about humanity's own past that could not be allowed to stand. If, as some Mechanicus heretics whispered before their tongues were cut out, the nightmare engines bore signatures reminiscent of forbidden human technologies, if the star-spawned plague recognized human systems with particular intimacy, then perhaps the Ghoul stars are not merely home to alien horrors. Perhaps they are the graveyard of some lost chapter of mankind's own sins, an echo of the age when men forged gods of steel and code and then lost control. That line of thought indicts the very foundations of the Imperium's technological orthodoxy. It is the kind of speculation that draws not only censure, but execution. In the wake of the Pale Wasting, decisions were made that shaped the future of the Ghoul Star's border. Among those decisions was the formal charging of the Death Spectres with their eternal watch. Their founding had already been steeped in mystery, their genocide shaded by the curses of the 13th founding. Now their purpose was made brutally clear. They were to stand sentinel against anything resembling the Pale Wasting ever rising again. They were to watch for Thexian signatures, for the telltale patterns of starborn contagion, for any hint that the nightmare engines had begun to stir in their slumber. Other chapters might rage and crusade and die in battles that would be sung about for 10,000 years. The Death Spectres would rot slowly on the edge of nothing, their chapter masters dying by inches upon the glass throne, in tacit acknowledgement that the Imperium had almost let the galaxy be devoured. This is the final, abiding horror of the Pale Wasting. It is not merely what it did, though the erased casualty lists and empty heraldry attest to a slaughter that chewed through worlds and legions alike. It is not even what it was, whether plague, machine, idea, or some monstrous fusion of all three. The true horror lies in how thoroughly it has been unremembered. Humanity now stands guard against an enemy it is no longer permitted to study or even name. The sentinels on the Ghoul Star's border stare into a darkness whose contours they are forbidden to map, listening for echoes of a catastrophe that official history insists never quite happened. In an age already defined by ignorance and superstition, the Pale Wasting is a wound carved not only into the fabric of the eastern fringe, but into the very possibility of understanding. There are places in the galaxy where the Astronomicon roars like a caged star, a solid pillar of psychic fire that any trained navigator can feel even with the third eye closed. The routes between Holy Terror and the fortress worlds of the core are such places. There, the warp is not safe, but it is at least predictable in its malice. Currents can be mapped, storms charted, tides of unreality allowed for in the delicate mathematics of translation. Ships vanish, as they always have, but they do so in ways that can be explained, or at least filed away under the familiar litany of causes. The Ghoul Stars do not offer that comfort. They lie beyond the eastern fringe, out where the Astronomicon frays into threads, and then into fraying ghosts of itself. The beacon's light is not absent, but it is scattered, refracted by malign structures in the warp that no cartographer has ever successfully mapped. Navigators who steer their vessels toward that haunted halo must do so with fragmentary beacons and unauthorized waystones, relying on rumors of half-tested routes and the dubious flicker of ancient, unsanctioned lighthouses. Many of those markers were set in place by rogue traders who are centuries dead, or by explorators whose own ships never returned. The consequences of such navigation are more than an increased chance of misjump. Time itself begins to warp around the edges. There are recorded instances of flotillas that have attempted to skirt the Ghoul Stars, only to emerge in sectors far from their intended destination, their chronometers insisting that mere weeks have passed, while the local administratum insists that centuries separate the dates. Other fleets have attempted the same trick more than once, only to find that the route never repeats, that what was a relatively clear passage marked by familiar disturbances on the first voyage becomes a churning sea of eddies and shifting reefs of unreality on the second. The only constant is inconsistency, as if the act of observation changes the path itself. In the face of this, many of the great Navis Nobilita houses simply refuse charters that involve the Ghoul stars. Those who accept do so for reasons that have nothing to do with profit or prestige. There are navigators whose houses have dwindled to a handful of bloodlines who take such contracts because they will take anything. There are those driven by obsessions, by visions half glimpsed in their third eye when a warp current stuttered and bared them to something vast and distant. They emerge from such journeys altered, their once vibrant features drawn and thin, their gaze turning too often toward the star fields as if expecting the patterns to shift under their scrutiny. At the ragged border where the Ghoul stars blur into more conventional horrors stands Orask, a sentinel world at the edge of a region that Imperial charts name the Iquathan Deeps. It is not an ordinary fortress planet. Its very existence is a statement of expectation. Orask squats at the nexus of one of the few viable warp routes that thread the deeps, its sky crowded with bastion platforms and system monitors, its surface plated with gun batteries and void shield emitters whose fields crackle day and night. Regiments of the Astra Militarum, night households, Titan demi-legions, and companies of Astartes rotate through its garrisons, leaving their bones in its soil and their banners in its halls. It is not a world intended to project power. It is a wall built to brace against a tide no one wishes to see crest. For most of its history, the threats that have tested Orask's defenses have been familiar in shape, if not always in name. Unknown Xenos raiders, dark Mechanicum, Heretex drawn by the chance to plunder the Ghoul Star's fringe, renegade warbands looking for a bastion to seize. Those assaults have been bloody and persistent, but they have at least obeyed the conventional rules of war. Then, in the latter years of the 41st millennium, something different came. In that year, counted by Imperial archivists as 977 of the 41st millennium, an eastern splinter of a Tyrannid hive fleet passed through the region of the Ghoul Stars. The Great Devourer is a terror legendary, even by the standards of a galaxy drowning in bad legends. Its hive fleets are expressions of a single predatory will that spans light years, their synaptic webs binding countless organisms into one terrible, resonant purpose. They are not easily diverted. They move as a tide, inexorable and precise. Yet this particular splinter emerged from the Ghoul Stars, twisted and disoriented, its usual coherent predation broken. It fell upon the Orask system like a wounded beast, lashing out in feral fury rather than with the usual cold efficiency of the hive mind. The Orask wars that followed were savage even by the standards of tyrannic conflict. Defense platforms fired until their barrels glowed white and split. Void shields flared and failed. Orbital habitats were torn open, their populations spilling into space in frozen, silent shoals. On the ground, Imperial regiments found themselves facing swarms that did not behave according to any known pattern. Some broods hurled themselves at fortifications, heedless of synaptic control, tearing each other apart in their haste to reach the walls. Others stood motionless under fire, as if listening to voices no one else could hear, before suddenly wheeling about and attacking their own kind. Veterans of the great tyrannic wars speak of the hive mind as a suffocating presence, a consciousness that presses down on the thoughts of anything within its reach like a weight. On Orask, psychers and librarians reported something different. They sensed the vast, distant pressure they knew too well, but it was fractured, riddled with interference, as if someone had driven nails of black glass into a song that was otherwise smooth and whole. The splinter's synaptic web flickered and spasmed, throwing up sudden lacunae where entire broods dropped out of the guiding will and reverted to mindless instinct, only to be seized again. Moments later, the defenders bled dearly, but they held. Astartes companies and Titan maniples broke the larger bioconstructs in titanic engagements that shattered entire continents. Orbital fire charred swathes of the Tyranid swarms to ash, clogging the atmosphere with the dust of devoured worlds. Eventually, the splinter broke apart, its remaining biomatter either consumed in purging fire or left to wither without the sustaining pulse of the hive mind. Orask survived, scarred and half-drowned in chitin and acid, but still standing. In the Strategia, where the campaign was later analysed, an unpleasant question arose. If the Ghoul stars can do this to the Great Devourer, what else can they do? The hive mind is one of the most terrifyingly coherent forces known to the Imperium. It coordinates the movements of tendril fleets across interstellar gulfs. It learns from defeats and adapts with appalling speed, and it is notoriously resistant to psychic disruption on a strategic scale. Yet a single passage through the Ghoul stars had been enough to twist one of its splinters into a stuttering, half-mad parody of itself. That suggests that the region is more than a mere cluster of hostile star systems. It is an environment that exerts a pressure of its own, capable of deranging even a force as pitilessly focused as the Great Devourer. Elsewhere in the galaxy, warp anomalies present their horrors openly. The Eye of Terror is a gaping wound in reality, a roiling storm of raw immaterium that vomits demons and traitor fleets in regular spasms. The maelstrom seethes like a diseased organ, its edges clearly delineated by the screaming of astropathic choirs and the tidal pull it exerts on nearby systems. The Ghoul stars, by contrast, are physically unremarkable. Their suns are cold and failing, their worlds dead or dying, their skies as empty to ordinary sensors as any other wilderness space. The malignancy lies not in obvious rifts, but in subtler warping. Some scholars of the Ordo Xenos and Ordo Hereticus, those still allowed to write at all, have suggested that the Ghoul stars may be the site of stable but malignant warp structures, configurations of the immaterium that do not manifest as open storms, but as standing waves of distortion. Under such a model, reality there is not torn apart as in the eye, but gently, continuously bent in directions that human minds and instruments are not built to perceive. Ships translated into such an environment do not explode or vanish in lurid displays. They simply find that distances refuse to stay constant, that routes fold back upon themselves, that cause and effect become negotiable. More radical voices propose something older still, something that predates imperial warp theology. In their view, the Ghoul stars may be the scar of a weapon used during the war in heaven, when powers now half mythic fought across the galaxy with tools that rearrange the deep structures of both real space and the immaterium. What appears to mankind as navigational madness and psychic corrosion may in truth be only the residual hum of a machine too vast for contemporary minds to comprehend. Such speculation creeps close to forbidden territory, for it implies that the warp, which the Imperium insists is understood at least in its basic qualities, may harbor arrangements and entities that do not fit within the existing schema of gods and demons. It suggests that there may be non-warp horrors, or half-warp predators, that operate according to principles that brush against the immaterium without belonging fully to it. Comparisons are sometimes drawn in closely guarded treatises to enslavers, those parasitic entities that slip through psycho minds into real space, or to the Umbra, those shadow-locked spheres that warp darkness into a killing tool. Such beings stand at the edges of current understanding, and the Ghoul stars are spoken of as a place where things of that kind might be native rather than intrusive. Evidence for such cosmic dissonance is not limited to twisted hive fleets and maddened beasts. The Vox networks and astropathic choirs that serve as the Imperium's nervous system have their own tales to tell. There are reports of distress calls sent from ships attempting to skirt the Ghoul stars that arrive at their intended destination before the original message was ever transmitted. Timestamps and witness accounts aligned in ways that should be impossible. In other cases, astropaths listening for expected communications from frontier watchposts instead receive ghost echoes of messages sent centuries earlier. Signals that should have dissipated long ago, now returning with new distortions layered over the old. For the savants tasked with reconciling such anomalies, these ghost signals are a nightmare. They turn carefully constructed models of communication delay and warp interference into ash. Efforts to map the paths such messages might have taken through the Imperium lead to diagrams that curl back on themselves. Loops of causality in which an order to evacuate a station arrives in time to be obeyed only because the station did not, in that version of events, send the call that triggered the order. Attempts to force these paradoxes into coherence have driven more than one sanctioned scholar to the oubliettes of the Inquisition, muttering about time as infection rather than dimension. The psychological toll on those who must live with such phenomena day after day is severe. Navigators assigned repeatedly to Ghoul Stars patrols develop mannerisms that unsettle their fellows. Some begin to draw intricate star maps on any available surface, obsessively tracing and retracing constellations from memory, adding lines between points in patterns that make no sense to anyone else. Others refuse to sleep under visible skies, insisting that the stars are changing position when no one is looking. Their third eyes, those precious mutations that allow them to look into the warp at all, become bloodshot and inflamed, as if the tissues themselves have been abraded by contact with something too sharp. Librarians of the Astartes and psychers of the Inquisition fare little better. Their dreams are haunted by vistas of orderly madness, fleets of dead ships drifting in perfect geometric formations, planetary orbits subtly out of alignment to form vast sigils that span entire systems, spiral arms of the galaxy bending like the limbs of some slumbering beast stretching in its sleep. Some emerge from their service convinced that something is moving through the Ghoul stars, something so large and slow that its passage can only be measured on the scale of millennia. They speak of stars being not extinguished, but rearranged, of dead worlds shifting position like pieces on a game board whose rules no one else knows. To most citizens of the Imperium, such thoughts are indistinguishable from madness. To those who have read the Right Sealed tomes and stared a little too long at the wrong kinds of data, they form a pattern that is almost more comforting than the alternative. If the Ghoul stars are the site of a single, coherent entity or mechanism, then at least there is intent there, however alien, control, however malign. The more disturbing hypothesis, whispered only in the deepest vaults of the Ordo Xenos and the Ordo Kronos, is that the Ghoul stars are not a lair, but a lesion, a place where the galaxy itself is sick. Under this model, the region is not merely a cluster of dangerous systems, but the locus of a lingering infection that has spread inwards from some ancient wound. Perhaps it was a battleground, where powers older than the current pantheon tore at each other, leaving behind fragments of their weapons and bodies. Perhaps it is a dormant mechanism, a construct laid into the galactic structure during its formation, half woken by some later event, and now grinding slowly through its preset cycles, oblivious to the lives crushed within its gears. Whatever the origin, the symptom list is depressingly long. Dead civilizations erased in ways that do not match any known pattern, Xenos breeds that mock taxonomy, warp currents that move in defiance of all expectation, hive fleets that enter as predators and leave as fractured things. It is important to be clear. None of this is confirmed in the sense that the administratum prefers. There is no single definitive report that spells out the cause of the Ghoul star's malignancy. There are only echoes, anomalies, the testimony of damaged seers, and the statistical oddities that accumulate when enough improbable events occur in the same patch of space. The official position remains more prosaic. The Ghoul stars are dangerous wilderness, home to hostile Xenos and treacherous warp tides. That is all. Yet the Imperium's behavior betrays a deeper belief. It does not treat the Ghoul stars as it treats other threats. It has not hurled a sector's worth of crusades into their depths in the hope of planting the Aquila on their most prominent worlds. It has not emptied nearby forge worlds of titans to grind their way through each system in turn. Instead, it has drawn a line and filled that line with watchers, with fortress worlds like Orask, and chapters like the Death Spectres, with Deathwatch bastions and nomad predators who prowl in uneasy orbits. It behaves, in other words, as though the Ghoul stars are not an enemy to be slain, but a wound to be contained. In a galaxy where gods bleed into reality and star empires rise and fall in cycles of fire and ash, that is what makes the Ghoul stars uniquely terrifying. Not merely the things that lurk within that graveyard of suns, but the way the Imperium has chosen to respond to them. It stands upon the edge, eyes averted, one hand pressed hard over a lesion it does not understand, hoping that by refusing to look too closely, it can stop whatever infection festers there from spreading further. The question that hangs over every sentinel, every navigator, every sleepless inquisitor staring at star maps in a darkened chamber is simple and unsparing. How long can any wound be ignored before it poisons the whole body? By the standards of the dark far future, the Ghoul stars are not unique in their raw ingredients. Hostile Xenos empires, cursed Necron realms, aberrant warp tides, and the bones of failed human dominions can be found scattered all across the galaxy. There are other frontiers where void ships vanish and demon worlds boil at the edge of sanctioned star charts. There are other sectors where dead suns hang over worlds scoured clean of life. Yet when battle brothers of the Adeptus Astartes whisper of the Ghoul stars, when inquisitors let their gaze drift in that direction on a strategium map and then swiftly look away, the dread that moves across their faces is of a different quality. It is not the wary hatred reserved for a known foe. It is something closer to superstition. The difference lies not in the horrors that can be named, but in the spaces where no names are allowed to stand. Other war zones are defined by their monsters. Armageddon is orcs, the Cadian Gate is chaos, the Damocles Gulf is the Tau and their restless ambitions. In each case, the Imperium can point to its enemy and say, "This is what we fight here." The Ghoul stars resist that simplicity. For every Xenos breed that has been dragged half into the light, for every Necron bone kingdom or starborn contagion reluctantly acknowledged, there are blank stretches of history where something happened and then was carefully unremembered. Entire campaigns trail off into silence. The pale wasting flared outward from that region and scoured sectors clean during the turbulent age after the realm of mankind fractured against itself. Yet there are no great frescoes on Terra depicting that war. There are no vaulted halls lined with the names of the fallen chapters. There is only a single steely praising courage against an unnamed horror, and then silence. Later crusades that thrust toward the Ghoul stars end in the same way. The Iron Crusaders and the Oparian Brethren of the Black Templars vanish into that dark, their final battles recorded only in ecclesiarchal assurances that they still fight on, somewhere beyond the reach of astropathic certainty. The Scythor fiends once harried Imperial shipping with crystalline weapons and spectral ships, and then, at the end of a hard-fought crusade, their core systems were found empty. No bodies, no wreckage, no trophies to hang in a chapter's reliquary, just absence. In this, the Ghoul stars become a region defined less by what dwells within it than by the holes punched in the tapestry of history around it. It is a place of erasures, tithe registers that skip over once prosperous worlds with a curt notation of total loss and no cause. Fleet logs that note the departure of crusade armadas and then never record their return or their confirmed destruction. Mechanicus surveys that trail off mid-sentence, overridden by censure sigils. In a regime that lives on record-keeping, that worships data as much as it does the corpse upon the golden throne, such gaps are themselves a kind of heresy. The way the Imperium reacts to that heresy is perhaps the most telling detail. Ordinarily, the Lords of Terror answer insolence with extermination. When a world fails in its duties, it is punished. When a Xenos empire becomes too troublesome, crusade banners are raised and entire sectors burn until the issue is resolved in fire. The Ghoul stars do not receive that treatment. There is no grand plan to bring the region to heel, no multi-century schedule of reconquest. Instead, the Ghoul stars are treated more like a diseased limb. The Imperium does not seek to cut it off entirely, nor to restore it to full function. It wraps it in bandages of steel and ceramite, and hopes the infection does not spread. This attitude reveals a rare admission of weakness. Chapters are commanded not to conquer, but to watch. The Death Spectres sit upon their dead world of Occludus, sending patrols into the dark and reading the omens that bleed from the glass throne. Yet they do not plant their standards in the Ghoul Star's heart. Deathwatch fortresses such as Pikemen exist not as forward bases for a great offensive, but as listening posts and executioners, ready to fall upon whatever slips past the sentinels and destroy it before it can reach richer prey. The Adeptus Administratum draws its maps with deliberate imprecision, washing out the borders of the region in sepia and ink, as if by making it appear indistinct, they can somehow render it less real. Even the Inquisition, whose purpose is the ruthless pursuit of any threat to the species, has chosen forgetting over understanding when it comes to the worst of the Ghoul Star's legacies. Records have been burned or sealed, witnesses silenced, entire lines of inquiry cut short by bolt pistol and virus bomb. The Ordo Xenos and Ordo Malleus maintain private vaults of data on the region, but even within those orders, access is tightly restricted. It is not mere secrecy. It is as if the knowing itself is considered dangerous, as if simply understanding too much about what lurks in that graveyard of suns risks providing it with another vector of infection. On the human scale, the consequences of this strategy are brutal and direct. Worlds that lie near the Ghoul stars are not cherished holdings. They are expendable. For the Death Spectres and their like, they are listening posts and levy pools, sources of recruits toughened by proximity to horror. For nomad predation chapters, such as the Carcharodons or the Angels Erythrian, they are anchor points for resupply and occasional meat for the grinder. When a new anomaly ripples out from the Ghoul stars, when a star-spawned plague glimmers at the edge of Augur range or a twisted splinter of the Great Devourer stumbles into known space, the first question in the minds of distant strategoi is not how to save the frontier populations. It is how best to use them. Garrisons are instructed to hold just long enough to identify the nature of the threat, to bleed it and slow it, while the watchers on Occludus or in Pikemen decide whether to attempt containment or to call for extermination. Evacuation orders, when they come at all, are often too late or deliberately limited. A population that remains in place can serve as bait, drawing a hunting engine or an emergent ecosystem into a position where orbital fire can be brought to bear. A world seeded with regiments and militia can slow the advance of some new horror just enough for reinforcement fleets to arrive. In that calculus, a frontier world is not a trust. It is sealant, jammed into the cracks of a broader defense to keep the terrible pressure from blowing the whole structure apart. This harsh pragmatism is part of the Ghoul stars. Horror, but it is not the beginning of it. The frontier has been shaping monsters on both sides since long before the Imperium nailed its banners to the sky. Nostramo, the homeworld that birthed the 8th Legion's night-clad killers, orbited a star that barely deserved the name and hung on the border of the Ghoul stars like a rotten tooth in an old wound. Its cities were built in perpetual night, its people raised in a culture where fear was the only constant and cruelty the only reliable coin. It produced slaver warlords, pitiless enforcers, and eventually an entire legion that embraced terror as a sacred language. Whether the planet was warped by its proximity to the Ghoul stars, or simply found a perfect reflection of itself in that direction, is a question without answer. The resonance is undeniable. Elsewhere on that fringe, the Ashenclaws carved out a pocket empire amid the detritus of dead human worlds. They did not build shining bastions of imperial orthodoxy. They built reaver fleets and fortress redoubts designed to shelter them against things even they did not wish to name. Their governance was simple. Those who paid in tithes of blood and industry lived under their shadow a little longer. Those who did not were stripped and left as offerings to whatever prowled beyond. These were Astartes, sons of a Primarch forged to bring humanity to heel, and yet in the shadow of the Ghoul stars, even they became scavengers and raiders more than crusaders. On the other side of the line, Xenos civilizations and Necron dynasties have been bent into grotesque parodies of their own natures. The flayed ones of Drazak, machine-pure entities driven mad by a hallucinated hunger for flesh, stalk bone-strewn streets under a sky gone sickly with age. The Scyther fiends fashioned weapons of crystal and shadow, hunted men and ships with an artistry bordering on religious fervor, and then vanished so completely that even their corpses could not be found. The region seems to warp purpose itself. Cultures that should be driven by orderly expansion or straightforward predation become obsessed with torment, with mockery, with the theatricality of horror. The guardians who stand watch over this slow, ongoing distortion pay a price that is rarely recorded in triumphant litanies. Chapters set to guard the Ghoul stars' approaches twist into near-monastic death cults, their entire identity tied to the inevitability of their own extinction. They recruit from worlds that know they are abandoned, shaping men whose first understanding of the Imperium is that it will spend them without hesitation. Librarians assigned to study the warp shadows around the region's dying suns do so at the cost of their own sight and sanity, staring into patterns that tug at their gene-wrought minds with a promise of meaning that never quite resolves. Deathwatch brothers garrisoned in fortresses like Pikmin serve out centuries, knowing that they will never see terror, never crusade. Beside their parent chapters, their lives instead narrowed to the endless repetition of readiness and autopsy. These sacrifices are largely unsung. No triumphal processions march through the halls of the palace to honor the countless unnamed who have died holding a line that official maps pretend does not exist. Their rewards are internal. The knowledge that today, at least, whatever lies in that graveyard of suns has not yet broken its cage. Tomorrow, the Watchers will rise again, check the augur arrays, consult the visions of their dying masters upon the glass throne, and decide where next to pour blood. For all that has been named in these accounts, for all the horrors that have been painstakingly dragged into the weak light of understanding, there remains the distinct possibility that mankind has only ever seen the edge of the knife. The Scythor fiends, the bone kingdom of Drazak, the pale wasting, the twisted splinter fleet that fell upon Orask, any one of these would be enough to blight a lesser region's reputation for a dozen ages. Yet in the context of the Ghoul stars, they feel more like symptoms than causes, like rashes and fevers hinting at a deeper sickness. If a single star spawned plague or a single set of nightmare engines can wreak such havoc when stirred, what lies at the true heart of the lesion? What dormant mechanism or sleeping predator might still be waiting, half woken by ancient wars and modern intrusions alike? The question has become more pressing in this newer age of ruptured skies and severed realms. The birth of the Great Rift split the galaxy, dividing the Imperium into Sanctus and Nihilus, leaving whole swathes of once-connected sectors isolated on the far side of a wound that howls with demonic song. The Ghoul stars sit in this rearranged cosmos like a tumor, now further from the surgeon's knife. The routes that once allowed reinforcement fleets to reach their fringe have become less reliable, more dangerous, or entirely impassable. Astropathic communication, already treacherous where the Astronomican's light frayed, has become worse. Whatever stirs in that region has been given, by accident or design, more room to breathe, while those who watch have been left more alone than ever. In the grim universe of the 41st millennium, horror usually has a face and a name. The foes of mankind are catalogued and condemned, their symbols etched onto purity seals and targets alike. Demons, orcs, traitors, tyrannids, the cold automata of the Necrons, the subtle poison of the Tau. Each offers a different flavor of terror, but all can be pointed at and cursed. The Ghoul stars embody a different terror, one that has haunted sentient minds since long before the first man raised a stone against his neighbor. It is the horror of absence, of not knowing, of standing on the edge of something vast and hostile, and being denied even the small comfort of understanding its outline. Here, the Imperium does not even pretend to rule. It does not trumpet its dominion or engrave its victories into stone. It draws a line, stationing its most ruthless angels and its most fanatical wardens along that border, and then it stares into the dark and hopes. It hopes that the pale wasting does not flare again. It hopes that the twisted hive fleets that stumble through that region remain anomalies rather than precursors. It hopes that the blank spaces in its histories stay blank. That is the true horror of the Ghoul stars. Not merely that there are things out there that can cleanse worlds and derange star gods, but that humanity has chosen, or been forced, to meet them with ignorance enforced at gunpoint. It has nailed its strongest shields across a wound in the night, and told itself that so long as the plates do not buckle, it need not look beneath them. Somewhere on the border of that unlit gulf, a Death Spectres chapter master lowers himself once more onto the cold crystal of the glass throne, feeling it, drink another portion of his stolen life. His eyes close, and visions of shifting constellations and slow-moving abysses fill his mind. In a fortress no one will ever visit, Deathwatch brothers polish weapons they will likely die using against enemies whose names they will never know. On abandoned frontier worlds, men look up at dim, strange skies and feel, without knowing why, like insects crawling on the inner surface of a skull. Humanity has posted its monsters on the edge of a greater monstrosity, set its most ruthless angels to guard a graveyard of suns, because something there once reached for the galaxy and may yet do so again. And the longer those guardians stare into that abyss, the more their thoughts twist around it, the more their doctrines and rituals warp to accommodate its presence, until at last it becomes hard to say where the watchers end and the watched begin. In the Ghoul stars, even vigilance is a kind of contagion, and the line between jailer and inmate grows thinner with every passing age.